people please stay in their seats? We're going to bring the chairs on stage. And we've got an extraordinary panel for you now, not with one, but two foreign ministers. We'll ask President Santos to come back. We also want to give Tony Blair an opportunity to do some public speaking because he hasn't had enough in his life. And we'll get the special representative of the United States of America. So we'll have, very quickly here, we will put together the pieces of what I think will be a truly important conversation about the challenges of security and ultimately peacemaking involving Ukraine. Okay, if people would please take their seats. We have been not just extraordinarily efficient here, but uncharacteristically efficient. So as I said, we have a panel which is it's quite realistic in its title. It says, first security, then happiness. Ukraine's strategic situation. I think that's important. I've been involved in peacemaking, peacekeeping all over the world over the last 4 or 5 decades. And the precondition for success is security. And so I think this panel is structured in a wise way. I can barely see. At the end, we have the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Slovak Republic, Miroslav Lajčák, and the reason he is so important, not just for his day job, but he's the chairperson for the OSCE effort dealing with this. I can't see who's sitting next to you. Oh, Kurt. Okay. Kurt Volker. I have my wrong glasses here. I didn't bring my distance glasses. Kurt Volker, as I said, besides being an old colleague of mine, more important, he is the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine. We then have, again, President Juan Manuel Santos, who you just heard from. Next to him, Tony Blair. And I would say Tony brings to this not just his decade as Prime Minister, but was truly instrumental, was the driving intellectual and political force behind the breakthrough in Northern Ireland. And I know that because I was fortunate enough to work with him on that. Also, when he was Prime Minister, got heavily involved in peacemaking in other parts of the world and gave what I thought was one of the main intellectual statements on the subject in a speech in Chicago many years back, and perhaps he will refer to that. And last but not least, we have the Foreign Minister of the home team here of the government of Ukraine, Miroslav Lajčák. I'm sorry, Vadim Prystaiko. I apologize. Vadim Prystaiko, the Foreign Minister here in Ukraine. I want to begin with you, Mr. Foreign Minister, because I thought it would be important to set the stage. You're going to get a lot of advice and a lot of perspective from the people on the stage, and we'll come back to you in a minute. But why don't we I think it's important to simply, let's set the table. Let's just understand where we are. Here it is, September 2019. We've got a new government here, but we have a situation which is not new in some ways. It's some recent changes, but basically it's pretty familiar now for what, 5 or so years. So let's just make sure that, let's just take a minute or two to set the table, and then we can talk about what are our options, what might we do from this point on. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to sit in this company, and I understand the the list of the people who are sitting at this table of this scene is somehow presetting the next couple of at least minutes of our conversation. And I won't take much. I would just like to tell you, to set up the table, that when I read the idea security and happiness next, I thought that so we actually leaked some of the information of what we're going to achieve next in our Minsk process. Because next testing area when we are going to disengage in the east of Ukraine is actually called Shastya, which is in Ukrainian happiness. So the security in first stages and then happiness, or Shastya Ukrainian. That's how we see it. This is very symbolic. But to tell what we are going to see and how we're going to operate in the less details, but just to set the dispute today. You know, there are famous words, security is not replacement for liberty. Or if we try from the other side and see how happiness can be sort of dehumanized and breached to the statehood, whether we can call nation happiness, what is it? Independence, sovereignty, liberty. Or at least it is important to Ukrainians who put the word liberty or happiness to such extent that they put it on the flag or even on the coat of arms of Ukraine. This word volia, which is now a translation is liberty and independence of a state and freedom of our people, that's how important it is to us. What cost of liberty, what cost of security, independence, and happiness of the people, of the citizens of the state? Is the state which is humiliated by unfair concessions to buy liberty? Can their citizens or can the citizens of this state be happy? Or happiness just a chemical state of the brain, which was so many times referred to, and by the way, in the books of one of the members of today's conference? So it has nothing to do with the state, nothing to do with the politics, completely irrelevant to the internal or external politics. Another interesting point, why some states are constantly unhappy with their role and place in the world. Why Russians can get so unhappy with the fact that Ukrainians chose another way, that we are preparing themselves, getting ready to even shoot at us. What is the level of this unhappiness which is making some states to understand their neighbors and some states are just wanted to go on and on and on, as we see it for many centuries all over this bloody lands as been described so many times. I believe if we manage even to touch upon these issues, I'll be much happier than I am now. And I hope that the questions we will have over the discussion will help us, all of us, and our states to be happier. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think as we continue the conversation, I think it's important to have two things in the back of our minds. One is a set of decisions for the people and government of Ukraine, which is they're going to have to decide, I would think, where to draw certain lines, what to accept and what not to accept, and what to basically say, we're not prepared to accept that, and we're going to continue to wait until we can get what our bottom line is. But implicit in that is to understand essentially where there's a potential for compromise and what cannot be compromised. And then I think for those, both for Ukraine, but those who want to help, and I'm going to turn to two who want to help in a second, which is the OSCE and the United States. I think the question is, particularly when it comes to Russia, what is it? It comes back to something that President Santos was talking about and Tony Blair is so familiar with. How do we make the price of not compromising significant for Russia? But just as important, how do we incentivize people to compromise? What reassurance, what incentives do we put for people on the ground or people who influence them that they can compromise and some of their interests will also be respected? And I think it's important to keep both of these calculations in mind, what can and cannot be compromised, and what can be put on the table to incentivize Russia and those on the ground, and what has to be kept in place in order for them to realize that not compromising is an extremely expensive option. So with that, why don't I turn to the Minister of the Slovak Republic and ask him to give his perspective given his OSCE role.
Thank you very much. I believe peace is the strongest incentive here, and we shall do everything we can to deliver peace, so to end people suffering, to end civilian being killed here. And when we want to deliver peace, we need several ingredients. We need a peace plan, we need tools, and we need commitment, resolve, and we need people support. Now, here in Ukraine, we have the plan, it's called Minsk agreements. And we need the tools, which is the Normandy group at the political level. We need a trilateral contact group chaired by the OSCE. We have the special monitoring mission. And we also have the parallel track represented by Kurt here to make sure that the main track is working. What was missing here up until recently was the political will, the commitment to deliver on Minsk agreements. And we've seen parties pointing fingers at each other and blaming each other for zero progress. Now we have a different situation. President Zelensky and his team are really committed to deliver. And by doing so, they are exposing the other party. Because the Russian side was saying, we want peace, but we have no partner to negotiate. Now they clearly have a partner, and they have to deliver. We have already seen the first concrete result, which was the exchange of detainees, of prisoners. We have seen very positive development on Stanica-Luhanska bridge. We have seen other confidence-building measures. So what is really important now is to continue with the efforts, to continue demonstrating the clear commitment. This will increase the pressure on Russia, and at the same time we need to keep the unity of international community. I don't think it would be appropriate to speak about concessions at this point, because Ukraine is the victim of aggression. So we need to restore peace, we need to restore territorial integrity of Ukraine, but we need to show that we really mean it.
I understand that you rejected the idea of concession, but reassurance is not concession. And what is it? Are there certain things that one can do in the name of reassurance that wouldn't constitute a concession of national interest? Is it possible to think that way?
Well, for me, the reassurance is to implement the Minsk agreements in full, and to do it in full transparency and accountability. So this is the reassurance. There must be no space for games being played here. And we have even the manual how to read the Minsk agreements, which is called Steinmeier's plan. And I really believe that this is a good basis for the continuation. And this also gives the reassurance. And also the international presence, international pressure is the reassurance. And again, OSCE is the major international player here. So and OSCE is fully committed. So let's take advantage and let's use all the OSCE can help to deliver.
Thank you. Kurt Volker, why don't, I think it'd be really valuable if at this point in the conversation, because you're also very much on the ground, we had your perspective. Then I'm going to ask both Tony Blair and Juan Manuel to give me their outsider perspectives. Let's get your insider perspective.
Well, thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. And let me also thank Victor and the YES organizers for inviting me back here. It's an honor to be here. I also want to state at the outset that we are extremely encouraged by recent developments in Ukraine in terms of the democratic elections, in terms of the commitment to reform. The palpable momentum and energy that you feel in this country is really encouraging. And that is something that we hope also gives some momentum to the peace discussions as well. To draw out a few points that Miro already mentioned, this is not a case of an internal Ukrainian conflict, a civil war, an ethnic conflict. This is one where Russia has been using conflict as an effort to put pressure on politics in Ukraine and government in Ukraine, and it's not working. What we've seen is that Ukraine has become more successful, stronger democracy, stronger institutions over time. And so to your equation, Richard, of what are the non-negotiable and what are the incentives. On the non-negotiable side, when I was asked to get involved in this issue, I asked Secretary of State Tillerson at the time Can we just make sure we understand what the objective is? And to me, the objective is unchanged from the beginning. It is the restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the safety and security of all Ukrainian citizens, regardless of ethnicity, nationality, religion, preferred language, safety and security for the people, sovereignty and territorial integrity. Those are non-negotiable. In terms of the incentives, I think that Miro said it, but let me explain in more detail. The Minsk agreements contain the incentives. These are protections for the population. These are amnesty for people who committed crimes as part of the conflict. This is a restoration of constitutional order within Ukraine. This is a guarantee of local elections so that people can choose their local representatives. This is a special status for the territory of Ukraine. All we need is for those Minsk agreements to be implemented, and we will have those guarantees. What has prevented the implementation of the Minsk agreements to this point has been a lack of security and a lack of opportunity to get to even that first stage of free and fair elections. There's been talk about the Steinmeier formula, which basically is that if you, once you have free and fair elections, special status takes effect provisionally on that day, and then once those elections are certified as free and fair by the OSCE, then it becomes permanent. But free and fair elections can only take place in a free and fair and secure environment. And so to get to that, we have to deal with the security issue. And here is where we talk about political will. Russia has thus far not shown the political will to end the conflict. I hope that Ukraine's success, I hope that recent developments, I hope the dynamic with President Zelensky, I hope the prisoner release, I hope all of these are beginning to change the context so that we can see progress forward, but we have to see whether Russia is willing to do that.
Actually, I'm going to use an American football expression and call a slight audible. Before I turn to Tony Blair, we have John Teft here. John was the U.S. ambassador in Russia. And I just want to get a short intervention from Ambassador Teft about Russian calculations at this point and what might be in their minds is given the new government here, given the situation on the ground. What are Russian interests? Where might there be some flexibility there? What could be done to get Russia to start showing the sorts of behavior that we've just heard required from people on the panel?
Thank you very much, Richard. Right now, I have to say honestly, I don't see a great deal of flexibility. I'm hoping that the decision to return the sailors, which Russia had no right to take in the first place, leads to something a little further. We were talking to the foreign minister the other day about this. And I think one of the key things that has to go forward here is Ukraine has to engage in its own talks, in the Normandy format or otherwise, to see how far Mr. Putin and his team are prepared to go. I was struck in the statement that President Santos made, that at the end of the day, you have to be able to show the people the benefits of the peace agreement. And as I was listening to you, Mr. President, I was thinking, so what is at the end of the day here? If we get the Minsk agreements, the people in the Donbass, the people in Ukraine will hopefully have a better life. And I guess I have to say very honestly, I'm not so sure right now that that's what President Putin exactly has in mind. I think Kirk referred to this, you know, we know the political goals, but do we know that they're really ready to follow through on sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity and a better life? And I think this is one of the key steps. And in my own view, the West has to do everything it can to support Ukraine in this next period of really testing and trying to see whether the process moves ahead. I would just add one other thing about Russia, and I mentioned this to Richard at the beginning. Last year, when Mike McFaul, Andrei Leonov, and I were talking about Ukraine and Russia, we finished the conversation by talking about the impact that free and fair elections in Ukraine would have on Russia. And I have to say, I haven't been back in Moscow lately, but I really wonder what the events of recent months have had inside of Russia. And I'm not talking about just the impact of people on the street in Moscow and the city council elections, but there's got to be a lot of people in Russia who are saying, hey, those Ukrainians can do this. Why can't we? I'll stop at that point.
Thank you, John. Tony, let me turn to you. You've had as much experience as anybody, both as an insider and outsider, dealing with difficult peace processes where violence was continuing, not just, but in particular Northern Ireland. What is your sense, both about what the Ukraine government might want to think about and what the Western countries, the United States, the UK, and others might want to think about in trying to be helpful at this point?
Okay, so I think you've got two different situations where you're trying to get to peace and security. One is the situation where you've got a conflict where there's right on either side, but where there's been a period of conflict for a sustained time, and then it's a question of can you bring the parties together and fashion some framework going forward which allows people to coexist peacefully. So if you think Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in the end, let's assume, or for these purposes, you might get to a secure state of Israel, viable state of Palestine. It's one type of negotiation. Northern Ireland, we were trying to deal with the fact that one part of Northern Ireland wanted to stay with the United Kingdom and another part wanted to go with United Ireland. Neither of those two propositions are bad propositions. So that's one type of peace process. But frankly, that's not really what we're dealing with here in Ukraine. There's another type of peace process when a country's been subject to unprovoked aggression. Right? That's this case. So in this case, it's like if I break into your house and tie you up, and then I say, look, I'm going to let you go, but I'm taking your TV and your furniture. You know, you might have a lingering sense of injustice if someone came along and said, yeah, that's a good basis for peace, because now you're not tied. Okay? So I think you've got to, in this instance, it's not the same type of process. But I think my sense would be that it really depends on whether there's a willingness on the other side, if you can construct a ladder for them to climb down, that they climb down the ladder. That's not the same thing as the first type of process. You see what I mean? So that's what I would be looking at. Is there something, a framework you could put together that respected absolutely your territorial integrity, that didn't attempt to rewrite the history of how this aggression came about, but nonetheless allowed the other side, with some, however much grace and dignity is possible, to retreat from where they are. Okay, that I think is this type of situation, and it requires the other side to be really willing to do it, and then it requires a lot of creativity to get the right formula. One final thing I think is this. I mean, I think what is really important and what is happening in this country, and you know, as an outsider, you have to be incredibly careful of saying something like I'm about to say, but I get a slightly different sense of this country this year. You know, I've been coming for several years. I just feel there is a bit of a spring in the step of the country and a greater sense of confidence. And I think the other thing is that it's when you get a country that's confident that it's able then to fashion the circumstances in which it moves itself forward. Because in the end, there are two questions in Ukraine all the time. There's, can you do the internal reform that is absolutely necessary to make the country strong, capable, economically successful, and then can you solve and get out of this nightmare of the Russian aggression. And those two things, I feel in the end, are going somehow to be linked. That the more the country is confident that it's moving forward, the more it will achieve the necessary creativity to allow this conflict to be resolved on a basis that's smart politics, and right and principle.
Thank you. I just want to push on one point. You used the phrase at one point about the other side. And it seems to me that one thing that needs to inform our conversation is whether we should think of, quote unquote, the other side here as singular or multiple. And whether there's a difference between the calculations ultimately of people in Moscow and people on the ground in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. And whether part of the strategy has to be to try to create a bit of a gap between them, because it's not obvious to me that their interests are one and the same. And if one can, that's where reassurance, I think, again, reassurance is not concession, let me be clear. And Minsk may have all the reassurance you need, but part of the, both the example that Ukraine would set by its own evolving political system, democracy, economy, becomes enticing. And a dialogue potentially with people there is different than with what goes on with Moscow. Because Moscow's calculations are much more geopolitical as opposed to something that is every day. And I just think it's a distinction with a difference. And one day it may evolve to be a distinction with a useful difference. Just want to put that on the table. Juan Manuel?
Yes, well, I'm not an expert in this part of the world, but I can see very clear similarities and in any negotiation. There's a matter of sequence. Who do you talk to and when? And I would dare to say that the way to weaken the leverage that Russia has would be by establishing bridges internally. The stronger the Ukrainians feel with the same objective of sovereignty and security, the less leverage Russia will have in the negotiations. So it's a matter like when you play simultaneous chess. You play here and you play in the other table. And I truly believe that even though it is politically risky to try to build those bridges and strengthen the internal politics of Ukraine would be the most effective way to lower the leverage that Russia would have here. There is something that always comes up. In the last panel about corruption, Jeffrey Sachs was saying, and Shimon Peres also said, look to the future, not to the past. This is always a dilemma in any process, whatever the way you approach it. How much of the past are you going to take into account to build the future? In order to build a strong future, you have to, in some way, to heal the wounds of the past. But if you maintain yourself in that past, it's very difficult to build the future. So it's a matter of finding the correct equilibrium. In the case of Colombia, we were the first and only country to apply the rules of the Rome Statute, transitional justice, a different type of justice, but that allowed us to find the equilibrium between the past and the future. Extremely difficult politically to sell the concept of transitional justice to the public opinion, which wanted revenge. But that was necessary in order to achieve the results. And you have to play in the different tables of the chess game, and the sequence here becomes very important.
Yeah, that resonates with me because Tony will understand this. We tried to do that in Northern Ireland and have yet to succeed. coming up with a formula for dealing with the past. I mean, as difficult as it is to make peace, keeping peace can be just as challenging. We're seeing elements of that in Colombia. We may unfortunately see elements of that in Northern Ireland before all this Brexit stuff is done. Mr. Minister, I wanted to come back to Ukraine for a second. When the President was here yesterday, and I hope I'm not mischaracterizing him, when he talked about the situation in the East as opposed to Crimea, there was a sense that Crimea was a longer-term diplomatic challenge. The situation in the Donbass in the eastern Ukraine was a more immediate challenge. Then part of to the extent that's fair and correct, it seems to me part of the political challenge for you all is to think about how to manage and structure a negotiation that focuses in the first instance mostly on the East without in any way compromising your position on Crimea. So how do you think about that?
I totally agree with you that these two, if I may call them projects, how to get all Ukraine back, which was snatched from us just some 5 years ago. But why President mentioned and why he described the things he did yesterday is just simply because the Minsk process and the Normandy group and all the meetings, all of them are covering one part of it. We were yesterday actually talking about the particular part, the east of Ukraine, whether it is more difficult to deal with or easier to resolve finally. That's we can spend some time on discussing, but that's what we have to keep in mind, that they are covered by different processes. And everybody is preoccupied right now with Minsk, Normandy, next meeting, and the rest. But there are bridges, and you rightly pointed, there are links. For example, these 24 sailors, which were returned, they actually were arrested by Russians in our part of the strait, which Russia believes their part because they believe that their territorial water of Crimea. So there is always this link between two processes, and we can't escape them. How to be carefully navigating both processes, how can you separate and not hurt the progress in one, but not losing the focus on another. This is extremely difficult political process, and it's been which we are trying all of these years with different success. Now the new government is trying to do it. What we see now, what all of us observe, that we are focusing right now on immediate success on the East, because probably you're rightly pointing, there is something we can achieve, we hope for it, we can achieve progress much faster.
Thank you. For Minister Lechuk and for Kurt, I just wanted to put on the table, this is not advocacy, it's sometimes a question is just a question. Is Minsk adequate as currently drafted? Do we need in any way Minsk Plus? Does it give you everything you need and the problem is simply that it hasn't been implemented? Or at this point, given where we are and given what we've learned, is there any way that it could be changed or improved in a manner that would increase the prospects for progress?
Minsk is what we have. Minsk was signed, agreed at given time, under given circumstances, and has never been really and sincerely implemented. Now we have a momentum, now we have a pressure, now we have a commitment. So I think it would be detrimental to the whole process if we started questioning the basis, which is the Minsk, or the format, which is the Normandy. We have what we have, and let's use it to the maximum extent. Otherwise, I would even say that those who are not interested in solving the problem, in ending the war, in restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity, would be questioning the framework, the format, or the basis for this. Those who are interested would use it to achieve this goal, which is clear.
Sure, and Richard, let me, first I agree with Miro, but I just want to say it a little bit differently. The Minsk agreements contain all of the ingredients needed for peace to be established and to be successful. The problem is not the agreements, nor is the problem the format of the negotiations. The problem is that Russia does not accept its responsibilities under the Minsk agreements. Russia is a signatory, it has obligations, and it has not fulfilled those obligations. But what Russia does instead is says that it is not there, that it is not responsible, that Ukraine has an internal problem, and that Ukraine needs to negotiate with the two so-called People's Republics. That is a denial of reality and a denial of responsibility that makes any meaningful negotiation impossible. And what we need to do is get back to your point about incentivizing. How can we incentivize Russia to actually take seriously that it has obligations and it must live up to those obligations?
Tony, you've probably spent more time in dealing with Mr. Putin than anybody around, certainly on this platform. What is your sense of politically and the rest, psychologically, what would be potentially the most fruitful approach? Because we are where we are. We can't redraft the past, but obviously we don't want the past to become the future.
Yeah. Yeah, that's difficult. Because my basic experience is that he understands strength. So I think, this is where the question of creativity is important. And, one of the things I learned in the peace process, not just in Northern Ireland, but elsewhere, and actually, President Santos showed enormous creativity in his peace process in Colombia. Is, you see, I think I like the fact that the Ukrainian government is prepared to make peace, right? I like the fact that you're making it clear you want this conflict to end. And I think that in itself then puts you in a position where no one can accuse you of just just going back in your bunker and refusing to look at the situation properly and sensibly. But I think that then when it comes to this particular situation, you've got to provide the incentives for the Russian leadership to realize that they're going to pay a price in all the other things that they want to do unless they take the way out and the ladder to climb down and don't assert principles that no one really can agree with. I mean, no one can agree that you can change the territory of a country today's world simply by saying, I'm just taking that territory for myself.
Can I just interrupt for a second? But do we have the luxury of telling the Russians, we can't hold our entire relationship with them hostage to this. We can't, for example, or we shouldn't, I would argue, refuse to negotiate a New START agreement, a successor to New START, which expires in 21, because of our disagreements over Ukraine. So the question is, how do we continue with certain elements of a relationship with Russia? At the same time, we have profound disagreements with Russia over Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. I mean, I spent all my time in office thinking, should I be worried about Russia or very worried? And most of the time I was just worried, by the way. But I think it's very important how they hear the expression of the sentiment you've just articulated. Because it's one thing to say, look, there are a whole set of things we need to do in the world together. And therefore, we are incentivizing you to do the right and reasonable thing in relation to this. If you're not careful, what they're hearing is, we're so desperate to get back into a relationship with you that we might trade basic principles in respect of Ukraine. And that's not going to work, I don't think. So I think it's about, first of all, assessing what is a framework that would allow the basic and correct principles of this conflict to be asserted and honored, and at the same time create the means by which Russia can extract itself from this situation and think that by doing so it will benefit in ways that are consistent not just with their interests but with our interests too. That I can see a way of working, and as I say, the creativity part of this is incredibly important because you've got to be imaginative, not in how you deconstruct basic principle, but how you allow people to take a step back from where they have been. So, for example, although as I say it's a very different situation, but in Northern Ireland, we were able eventually to get the nationalist movement to accept the principle of consent in Northern Ireland, as you and I both know, namely that Northern Ireland stays part of the UK for as long as the majority of people in Northern Ireland want it, which was a huge concession by nationalism. We were able to do that only by recognizing that there was a nationalist aspiration and giving effect to it, not in terms of breaching the sovereignty of our country, but in terms of allowing those who felt differently to feel they had a right to express their view. You see what I mean? So I think that's what I would focus a lot of attention on, the creativity of this, but it can't be at the expense of the fundamental principle.
I want to come back to the question and building on this theme of creativity, which is with the people who are living there. And again, whether there's any percentage, any incentive for us to think creatively. I mean, I can't remember who it was who ruled it out, whether it was Minister Lechuk or Kurt, any conversation with locals. But is there any reason to try to develop space between Moscow and people on the ground, or is that premature?
Well, Richard, I'd like to pick that up because last year in this conference we talked exactly about that point, and I think it is tremendously important what the Ukrainian government is doing right now, which is reaching out to the population, trying to access the population, provide opportunities for them, make it easier for them to access education, healthcare, pension, anything they can do, and to demonstrate that they view them as Ukrainian citizens deprived of their rights by this foreign occupation. I think that is a tremendously important dimension to build, and that the Ukrainian government is in fact doing that. We need to be careful. You're drawing a distinction between Moscow and the population. We need to also be clear that there's a distinction between the leadership of the Luhansk and Donetsk so-called People's Republics and the population. They are not selected under any free and fair process. They are handpicked by Russia, paid for, and put in there. So it's important that it's the population that we're engaging and not the illegitimate authorities that are there.
That's a useful distinction. And one issue that we haven't really discussed, it came up a little bit yesterday, was international involvement. I just don't mean Normandy, but in keeping peace, the role of peacekeeping. When I begin with the minister, but what, if any, role and when would you see it? There's both in the East as well as in Crimea, but what is your sense of things that could potentially, where peacekeepers could contribute, but also what needs to be avoided? Where would it actually be a trap, or it would add to the problem rather than resolve it?
What bothers me first is how often we use the words like creativity, imagine, incentives, and we are trying to find new and new ways of how to avoid the real question, whether we can press Russia enough to do what all of us expect. How can we create what we call conducive environment for any changes on the ground? How we can go with reaching out for the people? How can we bring more social and economic and others? And how can we have elections at the end of the days? How can we be sure that this land is still ours, and those ones who want to climb down the ladder will climb down the ladder on the other side of our border, somewhere in Russia and in Siberia, hopefully. This is what we are missing in the picture, and then we are trying to be creative again. We are talking about peacekeeping mission, which was not even in the Minsk, although Slovak minister rightly pointed out, and Mr. Walker did it again as well, that everything, all the ingredients are in place. So we tried with Minsk, we tried with different things, we almost failed, and now we're talking about, can we add another ingredient, which is peacekeeping mission? Can we offer Russia something else? And what a reaction of Russia? No, we don't want this one. We agree on a very limited mission in the border. So what I see that we are failing with just yet another attempt, or somehow bring something to the Russian attention, throw it at these feet, and ask, can we at least agree on this one? With peacekeeping operation, all of you read the history, the very rare cases when any peacekeeping operation resolved anything. We know the cases in Africa when peacekeeping operations were active for 50 years, and people were still dying, and the blue helmets were roaming around without actually bringing peace to these nations. So what I'm trying to frame here is that the peacekeeping operation for Ukrainian current government is something which we will resort, but at the very end. We're trying to make an honest attempt to execute what we promised, or our previous governments, which is all Ukrainian governments. And if everything fails, that's what we'll have to resort to peacekeeping operation. We'll ask international community to help with, and then we will have somehow to overcome Russian readiness or lack of readiness to actually go ahead with this peacekeeping operation in any form we can imagine again.
Let me just push back a little bit. I hear not on the peacekeeping point, but on creativity. If you have in your mind a very clear sense of what it is you need and want and deserve, and you have very in your mind what it is you can't go beyond, okay, that's totally understandable. But if it turns out, I mean, Richard Nixon once argued this in a different context, if you can expand a negotiation, and if it gets you what you want, there's nothing wrong with creativity. You have a bottom line. You pay a price we do not for the passage of time. So the creativity enters a conversation not to compromise principles, not to compromise or sacrifice interests, but are there things you can introduce that you don't mind being introduced if it provides the other side, whether it's cover or political space, a ladder, to choose your metaphor. If it makes it less difficult for the other side essentially to do things that you want them to do, that's why diplomats every now and then earn their living. I'd like to think.
We're not talking about the way I live and the way I earn my living. What I'm trying to tell you, I don't want to offend anybody with the new ideas how we can have another format, how we can create another thing. What I was telling that, at least we can be fair and honest with ourselves, reminding ourselves that we agreed upon something. We might hate it. Let's try to the very end. We don't want to throw just another idea of very creative approach. And we were learning from the experience of different nations, trying to understand what can be done, what sort of creative approach can be applied here. Are we looking for what we are trying to call the informational pushback? We have this idea in mind. We will create the stations, FM and TV, in each and every teeny, small city, trying to tell locals what it's all about, what Kyiv is trying to achieve. Are we going to open up our hearts as wide as possible to buy out the hearts and minds of the people? Yes, it is also possible. Are we going with our limited resources to create the Potemkin's villages in the front of the people so they would say that Ukraine is actually changing? So there are all these creative approaches. At the end of the day, whatever creative approach is here, we have to think about hard security, which brings us back to the beginning of this conversation. If security allows us to even be creative at all.
One remark on the peacekeeping operation. Peacekeeping operations, the convenience or the need for peacekeeping operations depends on the nature of the conflict and the capability of the parts or the state or whatever party is involved to deliver on the agreements. In the case of Colombia, for example, we brought in the UN simply as a guarantor that the agreement would be complied with, but we could have made the decisions we made without the peacekeeping operation. But the United States was the United Nations was so interested that there's a remarkable statistic that has to do with Colombia. The Security Council has never approved unanimously more resolutions in favor of any event than the Colombian event. That for us had been a tremendous boost to the trust that the two parties put in the agreement. And so the peacekeeping operation was important because of trust building and nothing more. The peacekeepers were not. We don't have soldiers. We don't have the blue helmets. We only have people observing and giving their blessing to what is happening.
I know you want to weigh in. In addition to whatever it is you want to say, I'd like to hear from you and Kurt. What is a realistic next step to build on whatever momentum we have from the prisoner exchange? What is it could realistically and usefully be done next?
First, let me offer my thoughts on the peacekeeping mission. I would not exclude the idea as such, but I don't think we are in a need to develop on it now. Because, first of all, you need peace to keep to send a peacekeeping mission. We don't have peace. People still die in Ukraine. We need to achieve what we want to achieve, of course, disengagement of forces, and then you may think about if there is a need of bringing in the peacekeeping mission to monitor what has been agreed and to make sure that what was promised will be delivered upon. What is important, what is necessary, is a clear mandate, full access, which is not the case, unfortunately, with the special monitoring mission. What must be avoided at any price is for this mission to legitimize this artificial internal border line of contact. So this is extremely important. This mission is an instrument, is a tool to serve our political goal. So if we come to the point when we believe it will help, let's deal with it then, but not now. We are not. Now we know what needs to be done, and one of the most immediate steps is exactly the one you mentioned: continuation of the exchange of detainees and prisoners. And from what I hear from my Ukrainian partners, there is a commitment to continue, and this is extremely important because it fundamentally changes lives of hundreds and thousands of people, and is also the confidence-building measure. So I was pleased to hear from my interlocutors during my 2 days stay in Kiev that this is in the cards, this is on the agenda, and this should continue. This is one of the most immediate steps that are to be taken if we want the process to continue.
Let me slightly qualify the conversation on peacekeeping. I agree with your basic point. Before you can have peacekeepers, there has to be a peace to keep. But, and it's a big but, in places like this, conceivably, say, President Santos and I were talking about Venezuela. Sometimes it's useful to describe what will be arrangements, because that can give parties the incentive to get there. If people believe they have interests that would be jeopardized if they make certain moves, if you can reassure them that those legitimate, emphasize the word legitimate interests, would not be jeopardized if they were to compromise or make a move, then a conversation about peacekeeping can be useful, even if you're not ready to actually have it. And that is my only point.
May I offer a very short comment on this? Right now we have two visions of peacekeeping missions which are incompatible, rather mutually exclusive. So I'm afraid if we start developing on this, if we start discussing how to merge these two visions, which I don't think is possible, it might really steer our attention from what is the most important, which is the implementation of Minsk.
Okay. Kurt?
Thanks, Richard. And I'm more in your camp on thinking about describing how it would work, because what I see is there is a potentially structural need for some kind of peacekeeping. If you have a situation where Russia needs to remove its forces from eastern Ukraine and where the illegal armed groups there need to be disbanded, but you also want to guarantee that political steps under the Minsk agreements are implemented, such as local elections and amnesty and special status and so forth, you may need a period of time in which there is a secure environment before you can declare Minsk to be fully implemented and the territory is restored to Ukraine. So there's a logic to that. The problem is as I described before, it's that Russia denies that its forces are there, denies that the People's Republics are illegal armed groups, and is not really trying to actually implement the agreements itself. It gets back to your point about creativity, and I just find it worth pointing out that when that is raised, it is usually a question directed at Ukraine, can you be more creative? Or a question for the West, can we diplomats be more creative? When is the question directed at Russia, can you actually solve the problem?
Just to be clear and to defend my good friend Tony Blair, he did raise it in the context of Russia mostly. And it was the sense of, in the conversation about how we can get most of what it is we legitimately, we in the sense of Ukraine, the West, require here, but can things be structured in such a way? It was not meant to compromise. No one's talking about negotiating about ourselves, against ourselves. That is not what the phrase. Tony, now that I've spoken for you, would you like the last word?
No, I just want to say one thing that I think is important. I think the degree to which this new government succeeds and delivers reform will have a big impact on this process. It will have a big impact because it will change the dynamic within the population here, and in particular in Donbass. And it will change the dynamic as well because if Ukraine's moving forward, the international community is much more likely to come behind you and give you big support. So my advice, very humbly, to the government is whatever else happens on the specifics of peace and security, this reform program that you've started and which is generating such hope, keep it going, because in the end, it won't just deliver a better economy and a better society, it will also greatly assist you in the process of creating a peace that's based on principle and is durable.
I agree, and I think it's an important point then. I once wrote a book called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And this is a place where I think for Ukraine, foreign policy can in part begin at home. And as we discussed yesterday, the best way to ultimately compete with Russian nationalism might be with the example of Ukrainian society. And that might make it, you can't beat something with nothing. And that would be the something that I think will ultimately undo a lot of the nationalist appeal. Let me thank everybody on this, but this is a serious subject. It's a difficult subject. Thank you for the perspectives that you've given us. I think you all get a half an hour break, and then we resume here with the summary debate about the liberal international order, which has been challenged as nowhere else by the events in Ukraine. So thank you all.